Hello everybody, sorry about that. My video had a hard time uploading from before. Sorry. The theory that I'm going to study is linguistic relativity. I don't have a lot of time to cover everything, so let's go ahead and jump right in. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was proposed in 1921 by Edward Sapir, and then expanded in 1956 by Benjamin Lee Whorf, who was a student of Sapir's. Believes in three worlds: the noumenal, which is the ultimate reality; the physical, which is what we perceive of that reality; and then the personal consciousness, which is our own personal reality that we construct around our physical perception. My research question is, how can the theory of linguistic relativity help us understand differences in international cultures? Because if we can understand international cultures, we can better interact with them and better understand where they're coming from in their cultural beliefs. Suggested our thought processes and the way we see the world are shaped in large part by the grammatical structure of the language. Whorf himself actually focused more on the Native American Hopi language, in which their verb tenses aren't based on time, but they're based on whether it's a statement of fact or of memory or of expectation. And that shapes the way that the Hopi people view the world. As now on to the actual literature part, there was a color triad test done by Davies, Stoughton, T. Jarrett, and Corwood in 1998. And it was a color triad test, meaning that there were three colors lined up on a neutral background, and they asked people who spoke English and people who spoke an African language called Setswana to say which of the three was least like the other two. In the end, surprisingly, even the Setswana speakers chose the color that was predicted for the English-speaking participants. In 2002, Alison Motluk was quoted in the article called The Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis Redux, and she points out the difference between number expressions. In English, you would only give, say, the number 11 of a group of pens sitting on a table, but in Russian you would have to give the number for 11 gender-neutral objects, since pen is a gender-neutral object in Russian, and in Japanese you would have to give the word for 11 long and cylindrical objects. In 2013, Rashid did an experiment where he took 10 ESL students at the National University of Modern Languages in Pakistan, and he put them into 30 to 40 minute focus groups about Pakistani current events. And they were allowed to switch between Pakistani language of Urdu and English as much as they felt like they needed. But the students tended to think of the English words as dry, boring, colorless, partly because they were used to the Urdu language, and also partly because they thought there was a little bit more vibrancy in the Urdu language. In 2011, Pelletier wrote an article about descriptive metaphysics, and he makes a distinction between strong Sapir-Whorfianism and weak Sapir-Whorfianism. And in strong Sapir-Whorfianism, they believe that no language can accurately depict reality. Any attempts to ultimately fall short. And if language could depict reality, the people who speak it would never know it. They would never know that they had the perfect language. In 2010, there was a study done on the geography of social ontologies. It focused on Wikipedia, but it made a further distinction between linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. Linguistic determinism says that translation is ultimately impossible, whereas linguistic relativity says that language is simply a mediator between the message and the speaker. They also outline three different approaches. The structure-centered approach starts with a difference in the language and tries to reconcile it. The domain-centered approach starts with the domain of experience or of knowledge, and then explores different cultures to see how they deal with that domain. And a behavior-centered approach deals with it starts by observing a behavioral difference, and then it studies the language to see why that behavioral difference exists. In 2009, Perlovsky wrote an article about language and emotions. He did an experiment about the difference in emotionality between Spanish and English, and he took 20 bilingual students, and interviewed them. And in the end, he found that when the interview was conducted in Spanish, even the students whose first language was English tended to show a little bit more emotion. He also says that some emotion is needed for everyday communication, but just the right amount. If there's too much, then everything's going to come to blows, and if there's not enough, then nothing is ever going to get done. Nobody will be motivated. In 2012, Hussein wrote an article about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis today, and he pointed out a distinction that Whorf himself actually made between cryptotypes and phenotypes. For example, gender in English is a cryptotype. If I were to tell you that someone's name is Taylor, you would have no idea what gender they were. And Spanish, it's a phenotype. There's very clear markings for what gender a person or even an inanimate object is in Spanish. In 2014, Carnes wrote a perceptual model of linguistic relativity, and he makes a distinction not only between strong and weak Whorfianism, but also he separates Sapir from that and creates a new category called Sapirianism, which is much more cautious and theoretical than what he calls Whorfianism, and it completely rejects the idea of a noumenal overarching reality. In 2014, Sarantakis he wrote an article and did a couple studies about the perception of color, space, and time. Ultimately, he rejected the idea of Sapir-Whorfianism as it relates to color and space, but he accepted a moderate form of it as it relates to time. In 2014, Hanson wrote an article about philosophy and linguistic relativity, and this was quite possibly the most critical article that I read about this theory. He referenced an article written by William Harvey in 1996 that claimed that the philosophy that people espouse is based on their language. Like, since German has a lot of compound words, they tend to blend philosophies a lot, and he calls that laughable. He says it's, basically one Rodney Dangerfield line away from being a comedy. And he gives 3 reasons as to why he rejects linguistic relativity outright. He says we can translate things in a roundabout way even if we can't translate directly, which is true. You can translate things in a number of ways. Language is fluid. Words are constantly flowing in and out of usage. This is something that Sarantakis also mentioned about color. Just because we don't have a name for a color doesn't mean we can't perceive it, and doesn't mean we can't name it so that we can recognize it in the future. And misunderstandings not only happen between languages, but also within the same language, so why would different language be any different? So, now that we've studied the theory, let's look at the implications, the theological implications. So what? Let's look at 1 Corinthians 2. It says, "For who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man that is in him?" And for us, part of that spirit is our language. Verse 11 and into verse 12 continues to say, "In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received the Spirit who comes from God so that we may understand what has been freely given to us by God." And that tells us that we have received, as a result of our salvation, the ability to speak the language of God. We're now able to understand the things of God. Verse 14 goes on to say, "But the unbeliever does not welcome what comes from God's Spirit because it is foolishness to him. He is not able to understand it since it is evaluated spiritually." And that's not to say that we're better than those who are unsaved, but we have been given that gift from God, and we are able to discern things, the things of God now, even though we weren't before, which I think is really cool. So that is my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and yeah, I'm glad I finally got it recorded.